2026 travel trends nobody told you about. What's just starting to catch on? Let's get one thing straight right away.
If you've been hearing a lot about 2026 travel trends already, you're mostly hearing recycled nonsense. Louder marketing, shinier packaging, the same old behavior, renamed so it sounds new enough to sell again.
The real changes never show up that way.
The real changes show up when travelers start behaving differently before anyone writes an article explaining why. When booking patterns shift quietly. When people stop doing things they used to tolerate without making a big announcement about it.
That's what's happening right now. And if you haven't noticed it yet, it's probably because no one bothered to explain what you were actually seeing. Welcome to Passport Pointers, where we talk about what's really happening in travel instead of pretending the industry hasn't been quietly changing the rules for years. This isn't a hype video, this is a reality check. The biggest trend shaping travel in 2026 isn't a destination, it's a mindset correction. Travelers stopped planning trips to win and started planning trips to survive intact. That sounds dramatic until you think about how people used to travel.
For a long time, the goal was optimization. Cheapest flight, tightest connection that still worked. Most cities in the least amount of time. Red eye stacked on short layovers like a badge of honor.
If you pulled it off, you felt smart. If it fell apart, you blame bad luck. That mindset doesn't survive repeated contact with the modern travel system.
In 2026, travelers aren't asking, what's the best deal first anymore? They're asking, where is this likely to break?
That question changes everything. It changes how people book flights. It changes how long trips are. It changes which airports they avoid. It even changes when they choose to travel. This isn't fear, it's pattern recognition.
The system taught people that cheap and efficient often mean fragile. And fragile plans don't age well once delays, staffing shortages, tight turnarounds, and full flights become the norm instead of the exception.
So people adapted. They stopped pretending the system was built to catch them when things go wrong. The first quiet trend of 2026 is this. Travel is now designed around containment, not ambition. Containment means fewer failure points. Direct flights over connections. One home base instead of constant hotel changes. Arriving earlier in the day instead of late at night. Choosing airports that function well instead of ones that look impressive. None of that sounds exciting. That's the point. What's interesting is how universal this shift is. It's not just older travelers, it's not just business travelers, it's not just families, it's anyone who's been burned enough times to stop assuming everything will probably be fine. And here's the part nobody says out loud. Once you make this shift, trips actually get better. Not cheaper. Better. Because fewer things go sideways, and when they do, the damage is contained. That's not a trend you see on Instagram, but it's one you see in booking data and behavior. Another trend building underneath this is what I'll call anti-flexibility. For years, flexibility was sold as a benefit. You can change this later. You can decide closer to departure. You can adjust on the fly. In theory, that sounds great. In practice, travelers learned that flexibility often means deferred stress. If every important decision is pushed to later, then later becomes expensive. Later becomes crowded. Later becomes unavailable.
So in 2026, more travelers are choosing options that lock in clarity early, even if that means fewer theoretical choices later. They're paying for assigned seats up front. They're choosing fare types that don't explode if plans shift. They're avoiding structures where one missed step triggers cascading consequences.
This isn't indecision. It's the opposite. It's people realizing that flexibility without guardrails is just uncertainty wearing a friendly label. And once you understand that, a lot of irrational travel behavior suddenly makes sense. Why someone pays more for a direct flight. Why someone avoids certain fare classes entirely. Why someone refuses to book the last flight of the night, no matter how cheap it is. They're not being dramatic. They're managing exposure.
Here's a quick reality check for you. When you book travel now, are you still chasing the lowest price first? Or do you automatically eliminate options that look like trouble before you even compare costs? Drop that in the comments. The answer tells you exactly where you fall on this curve.
Another trend that's already shaping 2026 is how travelers think about effort versus reward. There used to be an assumption that big effort guaranteed big payoff. Long travel days were justified by, once I'm there, it'll be worth it. Complicated routes were tolerated because the destination was special enough. That mental math no longer works the same way. The effort side of the equation increased, the reward side stayed the same. So travelers recalculated.
Now, destinations don't just compete on beauty or culture. They compete on accessibility. How hard is it to get in and out without losing a day of your life? How predictable is the experience? How forgiving is the infrastructure when things shift?
That's why certain places are quietly rising in popularity without being labeled trendy. They function well. Meanwhile, destinations that require heroic logistics to enjoy are starting to feel less appealing, especially to people who've already proven they can do hard trips. This is where a lot of "why isn't anyone talking about this place anymore?" confusion comes from. People aren't bored, they're tired. Another 2026 trend that doesn't get named is repeat travel without apology. There was a time when going back to the same place felt like a lack of imagination. You were supposed to chase novelty, new country, new city, new stamp. Now, repeat trips are a flex.
Returning means you know where friction lives. You know which neighborhoods work. You know how long things actually take. You don't waste your first day orienting yourself to systems you've never seen before.
In a world where travel itself demands more from you, familiarity becomes an asset. So travelers are going back, not because they ran out of ideas, but because they understand the system better the second time around. This is also why hidden gems are losing their grip as a concept. In 2026, obscurity is not the same as value. A place doesn't win because it's unknown. It wins because it's legible. Clear transportation, understandable layouts, predictable processes. That's the new luxury, whether the travel industry wants to admit it or not. There's a trend that underpins all of this. Travelers stop trying to beat the system. For years, advice focused on hacks, tricks, shortcuts, loopholes, ways to squeeze more out of a system that was never designed to be squeezed. In 2026, that mindset is fading. Not because hacks stopped working, but because they stopped being reliable. What works once doesn't scale. What works for one person collapses for another. And what works in perfect conditions usually fails in real ones. So travelers adjusted again. They stopped chasing cleverness and started chasing predictability. That's not boring. That's smart.
And it's why the most important travel trends of 2026 don't look flashy or revolutionary. They look like experienced people quietly changing their behavior in ways that reduce damage and increase enjoyment.
Most people can feel that travel is different now. They just haven't been given language for why. That's what we're doing. That shift away from hacks and cleverness doesn't just change how people plan. It changes where their attention goes once they start paying closer attention to the system itself. Because once travelers stop trying to outsmart travel, they start noticing something uncomfortable. A lot of what's marketed as choice and is really just noise.
For years, the industry trained people to believe that more options meant more control. More fare types, more bundles, more toggles, more upgrades. On paper, that looks empowering. In reality, it often just means more chances to choose wrong.
So in 2026, experienced travelers are doing something that looks passive but isn't. They're ignoring large portions of the menu.
They're not comparing every option anymore. They're pre-eliminating entire categories of choices based on past outcomes. Certain fare classes are off the table. Certain arrival windows are non-starters. Certain airports are avoided unless there's no alternative.
That isn't apathy. That's filtering. And filtering is what happens when people understand a system well enough to know which levers actually matter. This is why booking behavior looks less adventurous to outsiders. It's not that travelers are scared, it's that they've learned which variables don't meaningfully improve the experience and which ones can quietly ruin it. Once that understanding clicks, people stop spending energy on fake decisions. That same filtering instinct shows up in how travelers evaluate information. There's been a subtle but important shift in what people trust. Not sources, signals. Instead of asking, is this review positive? They're asking, does this person understand how travel actually behaves now? You can hear it in how people talk about advice. That sounds nice, but that only works if nothing goes wrong. That's fine if you have status. Those caveats weren't common 10 years ago. Now they're automatic. Travelers have learned to listen for what isn't being said. If someone describes an itinerary without mentioning transitions, buffers, or recovery paths, experienced listeners mentally flag it as incomplete. Not wrong, just missing critical context. That's why a lot of glossy travel content feels hollow now. It skips the parts that actually determine whether a trip succeeds. This doesn't mean travelers want pessimism. They want realism. They want to know how something behaves under pressure, not just how it looks in perfect conditions. That realism is also reshaping how people define convenience. Convenience used to be geographic, closer to the center, bigger hub, more routes. The assumption was that density equals ease. In practice, density often equals friction.
So travelers started re-ranking convenience based on behavior instead of location. How quickly can I get through this airport? How predictable is this transit system? How often does this route actually operate on time?
Those questions matter more than proximity now. This is why some secondary airports are quietly becoming favorites among frequent travelers. Not because they're fancy, but because they're understandable. Clear signage, fewer choke points, less chaos when something changes. It's also why certain major hubs are being tolerated rather than chosen. People will still use them when necessary, but they don't default to them anymore. They've learned the difference between access and ease. That distinction also explains a noticeable change in how people choose accommodations. Novelty used to carry weight. Unique stays. Quirky layouts. Clever concepts. In 2026, novelty is increasingly treated as a liability unless it comes with operational clarity. People care less about whether a place is cool and more about whether it behaves as expected. Check-in that works, policies that don't surprise you, fees that don't appear late in the process. This isn't about comfort, it's about trust. Once travelers have been burned by enough cute ideas that fall apart under real-world use, they start valuing boring competence. That same preference for boring competence shows up in scheduling decisions. Late-night arrivals used to be framed as efficient. Land, sleep, go. The reality is that late-night arrivals concentrate risk. One delay and suddenly everything shifts. In 2026, more travelers are choosing arrival times that leave daylight and flexibility on their side. Not because they expect problems, but because they've seen what happens when the margin disappears. This adjustment isn't dramatic, it's subtle, but it changes the texture of trips. Plans become less brittle. Small disruptions don't domino into big ones. The trip feels calmer without anyone ever saying, "I planned this to be calm." That calm isn't accidental, it's engineered. Another place this shows up is in how travelers pace themselves socially. Trips are no longer automatic group activities. People are more selective about who they travel with and how often. Not because they don't like others, but because travel amplifies incompatibilities. That lesson didn't come from theory, it came from lived experience. So people are planning trips with fewer "we'll figure it out" assumptions and more clarity up front. Fewer compromises that only work if everything goes right. Again, not dramatic, just learned behavior. All of this points to a deeper shift that explains why 2026 feels different without anyone being able to articulate it cleanly. Travelers are no longer measuring trips by how much they endure. That endurance narrative used to be celebrated. Long days, tight schedules, minimal sleep. Chaos is proof of commitment. Now, endurance without payoff feels pointless. People still value meaningful experiences, they're just less willing to sacrifice their entire nervous system to get them. That's not softness, that's efficiency applied to humans instead of machines. The industry hasn't fully caught up to this yet, which is why so much travel marketing still sounds disconnected from how people actually behave. But the behavior is already changing, quietly, consistently. And once you notice it, the logic behind modern travel decisions becomes a lot clearer. Nothing about this is accidental. It's the natural response to a system that became more complex, less forgiving, and more opaque. Travelers adapted, and that adaptation is the real trend shaping 2026, not because it looks exciting, but because it works. Once you accept that travelers adapted because the system became more complex, the last piece snaps into place. The biggest change in 2026 isn't where people go or how often they travel. It's how deliberately they interact with systems that used to be invisible.
For a long time, travel worked best when you didn't think too hard about it. You followed the prompts, you trusted the defaults, you assumed the rules were stable and that someone else had accounted for edge cases.
That assumption is gone. Travelers now behave as if no one is watching out for the whole picture, because experience taught them that's usually true. So instead of surrendering to the system, they're interrogating it. They're asking questions that didn't used to matter. Why does this fare exist? Who benefits from this option? What happens if this breaks? Why is this process structured this way? Those questions don't make travel feel fun, they make it feel predictable. And predictability is the new baseline for a good trip. This is where the industry misreads what's happening. From the outside, it looks like travelers became more demanding, more picky, less spontaneous. In reality, they became more literate.
They learned how airline pricing ladders work. They learned how airports prioritize flow over clarity. They learned how recovery decisions are triaged behind the scenes. They learned which promises are conditional and which ones aren't worth the paper they're written on.
And once that knowledge is internalized, behavior changes automatically. You don't need a dramatic decision to stop booking fragile itineraries. You just stop doing it. You don't need to swear off certain airports. You just quietly avoid them when alternatives exist. You don't need to announce that you value margin. You just start choosing options that give you some. That's what literacy looks like in practice. This is also why a lot of traditional travel advice feels outdated in 2026. Advice that assumes the system is neutral falls flat. Advice that assumes the rules are applied evenly sounds naive. Advice that focuses on hacks instead of incentives feels shallow. People don't want tricks anymore. They want explanations. They want to know why something keeps happening so they can predict it next time. That's why system-based content is outperforming tip-based content. Not because tips stopped working, but because tips without context don't transfer well. If you don't understand the system, you don't know when a tip applies, or when it'll blow up in your face. Another subtle but important trend is how travelers are redefining premium. Premium used to mean comfort upgrades, bigger seats, better food, lounge access. Those still matter, but they're no longer the core definition. In 2026, premium increasingly means reduced exposure. Fewer lines, fewer surprises, fewer moments where you're stuck negotiating with a system that doesn't care about your timeline. That's why people will pay more for options that look boring on paper. Not because they're flashy, but because they reduce points of failure. This isn't about status signaling, it's about control. And control, once you've lost it a few times, becomes priceless. This shift also explains why loyalty programs don't feel as powerful as they used to. It's not that loyalty disappeared, it's that loyalty stopped guaranteeing outcomes. Status used to smooth the experience consistently. Now it smooths it sometimes, depending on capacity, staffing, and timing. Travelers notice that gap. So instead of relying on loyalty to fix problems, they're planning to avoid problems altogether. That's a huge behavioral change. Another consequence of this adaptation is how people talk about good and bad trips. A bad trip used to mean something went wrong. A good trip meant nothing did. Now the definition is more nuanced. A good trip is one where nothing unexpected went wrong. Delays that are absorbed without chaos feel acceptable. Changes that come with clear paths forward feel manageable. Minor issues that don't cascade feel like part of the deal. What people won't tolerate anymore are opaque failures. Situations where the system breaks and no one explains why or what happens next. That's when frustration spikes. And that's why transparency is quietly becoming one of the most valuable currencies in travel, even though it's still inconsistently delivered. The industry is slowly reacting to this, but it's uneven. Some companies are leaning into clarity, others are doubling down on complexity because it still converts in the short term. Travelers notice both, and they remember. Memory is another underrated trend shaping 2026. People are no longer treating trips as isolated events. Each experience informs the next. Each disruption updates an internal rule set. Each smooth journey reinforces certain choices. That feedback loop is tightening, which means habits are forming faster and breaking slower. Once someone decides, I don't do this anymore, it sticks. Whether that's a fare type, an airport, a time window, or a routing strategy. That rigidity isn't stubbornness, it's learned efficiency. And it's why travel behavior can look conservative from the outside while actually being highly optimized on the inside. All of this adds up to a simple truth that most trend articles miss completely. The most important travel trend of 2026 isn't experiential, it's operational. People want trips that function. Not perfectly, just coherently. They want to understand what's happening, why it's happening, and what their options are when it changes. They don't need travel to be magical. They need it to be intelligible. Once you see that, everything else falls into place. The choices people make, the routes they avoid, the places they revisit, The behaviors that look boring until you realize how effective they are. Travel didn't lose its appeal, it lost its illusions. And in response, travelers got smarter.
If you want to understand why airlines, airports, and pricing systems keep behaving this way, and how to stay ahead of it instead of reacting every trip, watch the next Passport Pointers video that's on your screen right now.
If you understand that shift, you're no longer confused by modern travel, you're aligned with it. You stop fighting the system and start navigating it with intent. That's the real story of travel in 2026. Thanks for watching Passport Pointers, and I'll see you in the next video.